Despite being the golden standard of Assassin's Creed to a lot of people, Assassin's Creed 2 is a game that does have its issues, namely elements of Assassin's Creed, AC1 that is, that are either absent, changed completely, or generally made worse. And don't get me wrong, I love AC2, it's my favourite game ever for that matter, but they still exist and aren't talked about a whole lot as far as I've seen. So I thought I'd put together just a relaxed, less scripted ramble about the things that I think the first game does better, and even some of the things that I think it does best in the context of the entire series. So I hope you guys enjoy. Probably the most immediately noticeable change if you're jumping from AC1 to 2 is atmosphere. Like if you're jumping right from one to the other, picking up right where you left off, you can instantly feel this adjustment in colour. In Assassin's Creed, Vidic's office, the main location of the modern day, is so sterile and bleak. It's depressingly characterless. There is windows, but all you can see is this semblance of a homogeneous Roman skyline that you wouldn't even know is Rome. You can barely make out anything. There isn't really any kind of defining landmarks. It really feels like Vidic's office is the only kind of place that is real or conceivable. There's a lot of light, both natural and unnatural, but it's all muted and sapped of life. I really love the office because it serves as this really unconventionally scary, suffocating environment that even when you're alone doesn't let you forget just how trapped and powerless you are. Right off the bat with AC2, that all just dissipates and it stays that way pretty much for the entire game. And of course that makes sense, especially here. Desmond is being freed from captivity, so it would be bizarre for the colour grading not to follow suit. And it definitely isn't a bad change by any means. Like, it'd be really weird if moments like Ezio's speech on the Ponte Vecchio or Florence as a whole were coloured and scored like AC1. It's very much a personal thing how important I find this. But AC1, in regards to feeling and general ambience, is so much more memorable to me. And that isn't to say that AC2 fucks up atmosphere, because it definitely doesn't. It's just different. And there's nothing this series has done since that has topped that feeling of being truly estranged from everything, Acre and Jerusalem especially, from the antagonism of its citizens and this general aura of delinquency to this just fucking hollowing, nearly sickly at times soundtrack and the lack of any visual vibrance. It all fuses together to create this feeling of disaffection. You never feel like you belong and that you should always be watching your back. And for a game of its time, to be able to create that is really commendable. An issue that I have with like AC3, say, or Rogue, is that in New York City or Boston, I don't feel anything. I can't prescribe an actual feeling to these places. Connor and Shay both have reasons that, like Altair, these places would be inhospitable and uncomfortable, but it's rarely capitalised on. I mean, there's stalkers in Rogue, to be fair, but generally in these games, not only do you have a world that is much less interesting, but you lose this kind of dramatic component that serves a purpose to the protagonist and the story as a whole. Now, AC2 does have some excellent atmosphere. I love the Carnivale, or the tombs are pretty good, but again, I think it is just a matter of personal preference to me, that I prefer the misery and the mystery of Assassin's Creed 1. It feels more conducive with the assassin fantasy. I know it's like a bullshit meme, but the world in Assassin's Creed makes you feel like an assassin, and this assassin specifically, like none have ever since. This jaded, cynical outcast, this isolated killer, totally at odds with the world around him. It's fantastic. And that is why they can't remaster or, God forbid, remake AC1, because they'll put it through the fucking saturation machine. Like, after the 15th anniversary event where there was those few frames of the cinematic trailer that were graded differently, most likely just to blend in with the others, there was excitement about an AC1 remaster that looked like that, which is crazy. This looks like a holiday destination. I don't want to go here. I want to be scared, which AC1 does really well. Anyway, modern day is another big one. AC1 has my favourite, or my joint favourite modern day, alongside Brotherhood. I'm a little flippant with my preference. Like I mentioned earlier, there is a real eeriness and a mystery to this modern day. The ability to dig deeper accessing Vidic's emails and engaging in conversations, it's great. If you choose to, you can be really active in uncovering this mystery and discovering all these quirks to Assassin's Creed's 2012 that add just the right amount of context about Abstergo's plans and the greater world. I love being rewarded for just intuition in games, and so this is really cool. The framing device of Vidic's email specifically is great. You get all these allusions to just the massive power that Abstergo is, and unfortunately AC2 doesn't do anything like this. You can't leave the Animus, and you spend about 5% of the game outside of it. I do like the addition of Sean and Lucy, like obviously, but generally the modern day does take a backseat here. In fact, for the entire middle section of the game, there really isn't anything that makes the modern day feel prescient. Another thing is that AC2 doesn't really parallel Ezio and Desmond as often as they did Desmond and Altair, and there isn't that kind of thematic carryover that there was in AC1. So this is me from the edit because this doesn't really make sense without an explanation. What I meant by this is that Desmond and Altair feel as if they have significant parallels going on in AC1. In Solomon's Temple at the start of the game, Altair is ostensibly in the same position as Desmond. They were both born into a conflict they don't truly understand despite being instrumental to it, and both reject their creeds. With Desmond, this is obviously more literal as he has left the Assassins, like literally, while Altair figuratively leaves the Assassins in the opening scene as he breaks its 3 tenets, and they both effectively relearn their old ways as men who are forced to be more mature, under this captivity, basically, of an older, wiser figure who is pulling all of the strings. And it all comes together in this cliffhanger moment where they're set to take on a bigger mission than ever before. I hadn't really paid much attention to this until very recently, but I like it a lot. And with AC2 basically being the beginning of another Assassin's story, that doesn't really happen in the game, as far as I've noticed at least. Obviously there's the bleeding effect being used to harness Ezio's skills, and that is great, I do really like that, but I'm talking about narrative parallels, which I've never really seen discussed before, so let me know if you think I'm way off base on this one, because I just might be. But yeah, anyway, back to wherever we were in the video. It's very easy to get lost in Ezio's fantastic story, and to forget that the modern day exists entirely, unfortunately. Another thing that I think takes a noticeable hit from 1 to 2 is social stealth, and this might be a kind of controversial take, because there are so many additions to social stealth in AC2 that for a long time were staples. It's the social stealth system that was basically the foundation for everything that followed, so I'll explain why I like it more in AC1 despite being much more stripped back relatively. Assassin's Creed 2 has this massive focus on crowd blending. That was one of its new, really big features, and it's the most important, useful social stealth tool that you'll need in the game. It's very easy to just hire some thieves or courtesans and be virtually invisible, having to pay no real mind to your actions because you're invisible. You become a blade in the crowd in the most simple, demystifying sense in AC2. In AC1, however, you can blend only with a select crowd of monks that are dressed similarly to Altair, who is having to constantly contort himself around his surroundings. That is the essence of social stealth, finding a way, interesting ways, to make yourself a blade in the crowd, a sentiment that AC2 took a little too literally. It definitely isn't without welcome additions though. For example, the notoriety system I really like, as it adds a real sense of consequence, and the ability to further manipulate guards with factions, theft, the throwing of money. It allows for a lot of creativity. I think stealth is the area where making Assassin's Creed more accessible and more video gamey feels the most notable, and this takes me on to another thing that I adore about AC1, and that is its dedication to a very specific niche fantasy and feeling. It's quite clear that with AC1's huge success, its sequel was going to be much more accessible to really maximise the appeal of this new IP. And it's not that AC2 is not a real AC game, I've not gone that purist yet. Another few shit games, and we will be there though. It's stuff in AC1 like throwing you into these cities with no markers at all, because the game trusts you to use your tools as an assassin to find out what you need to do. Generally, it does feel like a game that's more trusting of your intelligence, and because of that you feel a real, genuine sense of agency from top to bottom. that over many years has been completely lost in every conceivable way. AC1 feels like more of a sandbox game than any game in the series, even those that pretend to prioritize choice. Still though, AC2 is very much an Assassin's Creed game, of course. It just feels less fixated on this niche that Assassin's Creed characterized. Like, we touched on social stealth and what happened there, and more notably there's the depiction of the Assassin-Templar conflict in this game being much more obvious, to the point where Assassin's Creed 2 is a heroes versus villains story, which is probably my least favourite thing about it. It's definitely not completely egregious in AC2 because the creed, or at least its philosophy, is nowhere near as central to Ezio's character and his growth as it is to Altair, at least in this game, but it's just so unjustifiably simple. It's a huge drop-off. It became even more obvious to me a few weeks back reading The Secret Crusade for a video that you jump from this morally grey conflict where even the more condemnable Templars like Garnier have genuine conviction and reason to believe in this ideology, to a conflict that is dumbed down to our cool friends and the bastards. Ezio never really has to reckon with or even think about any of it. Again, in AC2, this is. And generally, most of the stuff that paints the conflict or the key players involved as anything more than singularly motivated is exogenous. Again, for the most part, because there is definitely exceptions. An example of this would be Dante Moro, who's this really sympathetic, tragic character on the condition that you read his database, and you have the context of this betrayal, and effectively his commodification as just muscle once he suffered brain damage. But in the game, all you see is this brute without that sympathetic angle that makes him and his confession a lot more interesting. Whereas the batting average of targets in AC1 is fucking wild. Pretty much all of them are fantastic and memorable. I only really remember the names of every target in AC2 because it's a game that I've played a stupid amount of times. It's a pretty okay lineup and all, but it has nothing on its predecessor, not in the slightest. And I should clarify that my point that Assassin's Creed 1 is a much more singular assassin fantasy experience isn't meant to be me saying that AC2 betrays it. It's still focused on assassin gameplay with improvements and new tools that cater to that. It brilliantly expands on the lore and the sci-fi of Assassin's Creed with the full introduction of the Isu, which are only kind of hinted at in AC1. Generally, it adds a ton of intriguing lore that for years was central to the series, with a lot of it being further expanded upon in later AC media. AC2's mainstreamness, to me, feels much less like outright excising everything that made the first game so beloved, and more like addressing criticisms and alleviating some of the more daunting, less accessible components of AC1. I think it still has the beating heart of Assassin's Creed for sure though, it just doesn't quite beat as strongly, if that makes sense. But saying that, AC1 is the pinnacle, and AC2 does build on it in a lot of great ways. It's nowhere near what we've had for the last several years. There is absolutely still a soul there. It's a great game. And lastly, I want to talk about combat, which I prefer in AC1. I fucking love this combat system so much. To me, it feels like probably the best kind of compromise, where you're an incredibly capable, efficient killer, but one that isn't invincible and is quite vulnerable, actually. You can get just eviscerated in this game if you make a misstep at the wrong time. It feels like the combat system that rewards genuine skill the most. It always frustrates me when people claim that the classic games are you just waiting to counter and nothing else. If you've only experienced one dimension of a fairly varied combat system, that is your fault and not the fault of the system. You have combos here, which are a lot of fun. The choice between heavy and light attacks that you might want to alternate depending on guard types. Hidden blade counters, which are a lot more punishing than they are in AC2. Now, AC2 maintains a lot of stuff that I like, and even adds to some of it with a wider variety of weapons, of miscellaneous skills like the dirt throw, and while it's still pretty good, especially when you really dig deep into all of its sort of expanded mechanics, it feels dumbed down in comparison. By making enemies just that bit stronger, Ezio feels less like a capable assassin, and almost like a worthy adversary to these guys that are just dudes. Whereas in AC1, Altair has this power which is balanced by giving fairly severe consequence to your mistakes. In 2, you don't really have the power or the consequence. You're much too tanky health-wise, like in Brotherhood, but you don't have the advantage of power. Also, I apologise if the gameplay here isn't representative of any of this skill that I'm talking about, AC YouTuber or not, I fucking suck at these games. Which actually reminds me, if you do want to be good at AC2's combat and have a better understanding of some of its intricacies that the game isn't given credit for, I'll link a really cool playlist from Execution Producer that features a comprehensive guide on the combat system that I really like. Anyway, I think that is kind of it. Do let me know what you guys think. I know that I always say that, but I do really mean it with this one especially, and I'll be in the comments for sure. With all that said, thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, maybe leave a like, and if you didn't, maybe let me know why. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.